everyone, and welcome to another Gold Live event for National Quilters Circle. Today I'm going to talk about prairie points. So prairie points are fun little points that can be added to multiple different places in a quilt. A lot of times people think of prairie points and they think of it something that has to go on the edge of a quilt. And while that is where it is normally found, there are some ways that you can incorporate them into some fun blocks as well. So here is an example of what a prairie point is. So it is a point, but what is specific about a prairie point is that it has some finished edges on it. So of your point, of your triangle that is your little point here, you need to have at least two of this edges finished. So you have a finished edge right here and here, so these are both going to be on the outside, and then you have your raw edge, which is the edge that's going to be stitched onto your quilt. So having those finished edges is what's important in your point, and you get those finished edges by folding. So just real quick to show you how this would go onto the edge of a quilt, we're going to pretend that this tiny little sample here is our little quilt. So if this was our quilt top, and we were going to be adding our prairie point to the edge of our quilt. Generally this is done, if you want it to stick off of the edge of your quilt, it would be instead of a binding. So you would simply be aligning your raw edges. So you have the raw edge of your prairie point aligned with the raw edge of your quilt, and then when you stitch it, it's going to be flipped to the wrong side, and then this is the point that you have out along the outside edge of your quilt. And then there are various ways you can sort of cover up or finish the backing of your quilt. This is something that can be done if you stitch it to just the top fabric first, flip it under and press it, and then you actually fold under your backing fabric, and then you have two folded edges you just kind of top stitch together. So there's various ways to finish those edges, and that's not entirely what I'm going to be focusing on. I want to focus on how you actually create these prairie points. So there are 4 different ways that I'm going to show you how to create them today, and I'm going to make them all the same size, and they are going to start by using 4-inch squares. So just know that you can make your prairie point any size that you want. You just essentially start with a square if you want yours to be similar sizes to mine. So mine are going to finish at about a 2-inch height, which by the time you stitch that into your quilt using your 1/4-inch seam allowance, which would be right here, you're going to have about an 1 3/4-inch prairie point. So start with your square, and we are simply going to fold it in half like so. I'm going to finger press first. So if I'm creating my prairie points, I am going to have a stack of squares that I am folding together. I'm going to fold them all one way first and finger press them, have another stack of those, and then take them over and press them hard with the iron. But fold it in half first, finger press, so that's just using the tip of your finger and sort of give it a crease. When you're doing this, it is very important that you do it lightly and you do it in little segments at a time, because obviously this is a square, right, that you've cut on the straight of grain of your fabric here. You're folding it in half, which makes this a bias edge. So as you can see, it is very, very stretchy. So you want to be finger pressing it, but you don't want to be stretching it. So I'm going in little tiny increments, just giving it a press all along the edge. And then I'm going to fold it in half again. So here's my folded edge, my 2 raw edges. I'm going to fold it back down on itself here, and again, give it another finger press this way. Now I have a finished folded edge, a finished folded edge, and a raw edge, and now I could take this over to my machine and press it. I'm sorry, take it over to my pressing mat and press it, and then I would have my finished prairie point. So now obviously, if you are making a quilt, and this is going to be on the edge of your quilt, you're going to need lots and lots and lots of prairie points. So this is the type of prairie point that is very easy to put together with another one and make them look continuous because of where the opening is on the point. So this one almost has like a little fortune cookie look almost, so it kind of opens up here on the side, which is perfect because as you are making multiple of these and you want to layer them together, you can actually lay one down, you can open it up, lay the next one down inside like so, and you have these overlapping prairie points like this. So you have a continuous point going all along the edge of your quilt. So when you are doing this, you want to play around with the amount that you overlap them. So if you want them really, really, really close together, you can push them in more like this, or you can pull them apart. One thing I would recommend is making sure you have them overlapped by where the overlapping point, so the very lowest point here of this valley, so this very lowest point here is at least 1/4 of an inch away from this raw edge. So if I were to put it on my cutting mat and pull it down, I want to make sure I have at least 1/4 of an inch here. That way when I actually stitch this onto my quilt, if I'm using that 1/4 inch seam allowance, I'm not going to have a gap in between them. It will just look seamless, one right into the next. So that's how you make the side fold prairie point, and you could go ahead and just sew that right onto your quilt like I did in the very, very beginning. And I'm going to answer a couple questions because I do see we have some live viewers watching right now, and I do want to answer a couple questions so you don't think I'm ignoring you. But you've asked about joining the challenge and not being able to get information because you haven't been accepted to the group. So if you are unaware of what we're talking about, we have a quilt challenge going on right now, the NQC Quilt Block Challenge. That is a free challenge you can join. You can do that by visiting our social media pages, the Facebook challenge group, and that, I believe, is the group you're talking about joining. Once you hit join, you do have to be approved into that group, and we do usually go through that once a day or so and make sure that we are approving you. So it could just take a little bit and we will get you approved. So go ahead and join that. You can sign up for the challenge on the Facebook page or on the website, and that is what we're talking about. So just know that that's a little bit separate from what we're talking about now, but I didn't want you to think that I was ignoring any questions. So if you have any other questions, go ahead and feel free to ask those as well. So that was how you make these side open prairie points that you can easily join together and go all along your quilt. Another fun one that you can make is one that has a prairie point that is open in the front or has a line in the front as opposed to on the side. So this is one that you're not going to be able to overlap as you're putting them together, but it is sort of another fun design element if you want to have this line be either part of the decoration of the front of your prairie point, or if you want to make this into the back of your prairie point and you don't want to see any openings on the front, you don't want openings along the side, this is how you can sort of make that look. So again, we are going to start with our 4-inch square. So really this is just a lot of folding to make these fun points. But we're going to take this one and we're going to simply fold it in half like so. Again, I'm going to finger press first, so this one you don't have to be as careful because this isn't a biased edge as we're folding along here, but you still just want to make sure that you are going in little bits at a time really, and you're starting from the center and working your way out. So if I were to take and just hold down this edge and try and press this fold going all the way here, you can see how it just kind of shifts the fabric. It's just not, you could end up not being lined up or not have your square folded perfectly in half if you try and push it from one side all the way to the other. So always just start in the center and work your way out. That is for everything. Prairie points, that's for if you're pressing open a seam in general, if you have just sewn 2 blocks together, doesn't matter what it is, and you're going to finger press it, always start in the middle, work your way out, and then do little bits at a time. Now you need to find the center. So if you have your cutting mat and you can easily line it up and see that this is your center, perfect. Otherwise, go ahead and just fold it in half and give yourself a little indication of where the center is. But now we're just going to fold down to the center, right like so. Again, press, finger press first, and fold the other side down and finger press again. And now you have your prairie point that has the fold opening along the center. So this is one, of course, that you cannot overlap. So we just did ones that had openings along the sides that you could overlap your prairie points. This one's not going to allow you to do that, to tuck one inside the other. So you're just going to have to lay one on top of the other. But again, you can still adjust how much you want to overlap them. Still recommend at least having that 1/4 of an inch as you attach those to the edge of your quilt. So another fun option that's very, very similar to this front opening or front fold prairie point is one that is sometimes called a lined prairie point. So it is one that is similar, comes together very similarly in that you are going to start with your square of fabric, fold it in half and fold your sides in, but you have 2 different colors that you're working with. So in order to get those 2 different colors, you're actually going to start with strips of fabric. So you have 2 strips of fabric. Those need to correspond with the fabrics that you want, of course, in your prairie point. And the one that is going to be the lining, or the one that's going to be just peeking out here, so right here in the center, is the one that's going to be bigger. So this one here I've cut at 2.5. And then your outer fabric, obviously the one that is seen the most, the one that is all on the wrong side or the back side of the prairie point and just on the edges here on the front, this one is going to be cut at 2 inches. So this is going to make it where we sew them together. So I'm going to take and align these up and sew them right sides together. So they obviously are going to align on one side but not the other. And I'm not really worried about pinning these because it is just a little sample here. And my strip isn't that long. But if you are sewing a very, very, very long strip because you are making enough prairie points to go around an entire quilt, then you may want to pin. But what I like to do is just sort of adjust as I go. So I will stop every now and then, and I will stop either by pushing the needle down, wrong button, sorry, by pushing the needle down button or by using my hand wheel and lowering that needle down, and then I can just make an adjustment here, lift up the top fabric, make sure my edges are still aligned, and then keep stitching. Right, like so, and I'll just stitch right off the edge and go ahead and cut my fabrics. Once you have your threads clipped, now you have your pieces that are sewn together, and again, they should be aligned on the edge you just stitched and not aligned down here. And now you want to press them open, like so. Again, I'm just going to finger press first, all along. Now when you fold them in half, you want to align those raw edges. So I'm aligning the raw edges right like so, which should give you just this 1/4 inch right up here at the top of that lining fabric exposed. So you want to make sure that your edges are aligned and that your 1/4 inch is accurate all the way along the top. So if while you were stitching, maybe you got off your 1/4 inch just a little bit, and maybe it's not lining up to where it's always a 1/4 inch exposed here. What's more important on this particular prairie point is that the distance between the center and where your outer fabric shows is consistent. So I have a consistent 1/4 inch all along here and all along here. What's not necessarily as important is that these lower raw edges line up perfectly. So what I mean by that is if as you're coming along, say you've folded, I'm going to exaggerate, but pretend those are lined up right now, and you can see up here that this is not quite a 1/4 inch, it's just under, and this is just over. Make any adjustments you need to down here at the lower edge to make sure that this is a perfect 1/4 inch all the way along, even if those raw edges aren't aligned. This is one where you will have to bring in your pressing mat for this one. So I'm going to grab that now because I'm just going to need a little bit more heat and maybe even a little bit of steam to get this pressed flat, because you have that seam allowance that you're working with in here that you really didn't have with that other one. So I'm going to go ahead and flip this around, make it a little easier for myself to see those raw edges. Make sure that those are aligned and then give it a press. So the other thing that can help when you're doing this is to make sure that your seam allowance is laying flat. So your seam allowance is a 1/4 inch, right? So the seam allowance that you've just stitched is a 1/4 inch. And when you're folding this down and you're aligning those raw edges, you should have a 1/4 inch exposed, which means that that seam allowance should fit just perfectly within this little area of that lining fabric there, and it should lay flat. If it's not, or you're having issues getting it to lay flat, then you may want to trim your seam allowance down just a little bit if you need to. But if you've done all of your stitching and you're cutting accurately from the beginning, it should all line up. So I'm making sure that seam allowance is laying flat, then I'm folding it under and giving it a press, right like so. And then from here, it's a very similar technique to making the previous prairie point that we just did, and that we now have essentially that square that we started with first, and this is the folding in half step that we just did. We just folded it in half with 2 different colors. So give it a nice press. like so. Go ahead and move my pressing mat out of the way. And now you can take this here and we can cut it down into strips. So when you were using the measurements that I just did, so I had one that was at 2.5 and one that was at 2, when you stitch that together, it should measure 4 inches. So you still want to be cutting a square. So I started with this 4 inches here. So I'm going to be cutting this rectangle into 4 inches. So you can see my edge is not quite perfect over here. Plus this is actually my selvage edge. I don't know if you can see all those little dots in there. So I want to be cutting those off. So I'm going to bring this just over a tiny bit and I'm going to cut this down into a 4-inch rectangle. So again, if you're using my beginning measurements of a 2-inch strip and a 2.5-inch strip, they will finish at 4 inches. So then you're going to cut your folded strip down into a 4-inch rectangle like this. But I did mention that you can make prairie points at in any size that you want. And it's sort of an easy thing to be able to measure as you go. So if you decide you want to use any number of strips from the very beginning to make it a different width, once you sew them all together, just measure how wide they are and then cut that length from the strip so you get a square. Then of course it's folded in half. Then you will flip it over. And we're of course going to do the same thing where we find our center and we fold our edges down right like so. And we should be able to press that nice and flat. And then you can see with this one here, I've actually done just a couple little basting stitches right along here within 1/4 inch. So if I'm going to be stitching this onto my quilt, I'm going to be doing that using that 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I want to make sure that my stitches here don't extend past that 1/4 inch. So I usually just try and go really close to the edge, about 1/8 inch, and really only within this lining fabric part is all that's necessary. Just a couple little stitches to hold that in place. And of course, if you have pressed your seam allowance flat, you should have no extra bulk here, and your little prairie point, your lined prairie point, should lay nice and flat. And again, this is another one where you're going to have to overlap them when you add them to the edges of your quilt. So if you've seen these 3 methods for making your prairie points and you think, okay, that's really fun, that's kind of cool looking, I really want to add this to my quilt, but it seems kind of tedious to sit there and make 100 prairie points individually and then have to overlap them and measure and make sure that they are all perfectly aligned. Is there a quicker way? And the answer is yes. There is a quicker way that you can make those side open prairie points. So again, those were the very beginning ones. Those were these ones here where they kind of fit into one another. There is a quicker way to make these prairie points, and it's in a way called continuous prairie points, and that's what I'm going to show you now. And this is a way where you can make a bunch of these prairie points all at the same time. So I want to be consistent in the size of prairie point that I'm showing you, which is how I chose my strip measurement here. Let me just move a couple things out of my way so I can bring this up in here. But so I have been using a 4-inch square to talk about all of the prairie points that we've made up into this point. They've all started with 4-inch squares. So I want to use that same size, so my prairie points finish at the same size as my previous ones. So this is going to start at an 8-inch rectangle. So I have my, it's 8 inches folded in half. So this is my 4-inch fold line. So that's how you're going to determine your measurement, is whatever you say you're practicing around or playing around with your prairie points and you were using 2-inch squares to make your prairie point, and now you want to try out this technique, you would need a 4-inch strip of fabric. So you take your fabric first, and you're going to fold it in half and give yourself a nice hard fold line. Now I'm not going to be needing to do any more sewing on this one, it's just going to be folding, so I'm going to move my machine even out of the way so I can get this whole piece of fabric up here and show you how to do some marking. So I'm going to use just my standard ballpoint pen because I want you to be able to see the marking, but you can be using any kind of fabric marker you want. The lines I'm drawing are going to be cut lines, so you don't have to worry about whether or not this is removable. But I want to be now drawing 4-inch squares onto my pieces of fabric, and I'm going to offset them. So my first one here, I'm going to start from right here at this edge. I'm going to measure over my 4 inches, and I'm going to draw a line that's going to give me a 4-inch square. So this is now a 4-inch square, right? So I'm going to do that all along here. Every 4 inches, I'm drawing a line to make a square. Right like so, right like so. And then my piece of fabric isn't exactly divisible by 4, so I'm going to go ahead and just trim this off here. You're always going to have just a little bit of extra because you have to offset your points, but I'll go ahead and just trim this one here so we have all of these are perfect on the bottom. Now we need to offset 4-inch squares along the top. So I'm going to start, and if you're not using 4-inch, if you're using your own measurement, divide whatever your number is in half. So if I have a 4-inch square, instead of measuring over 4 inches, I'm going to measure over 2 inches. And I'm going to draw my line. And this is going to be the side of my now 4-inch square. So I can draw a line here, come over, oops, move my fabric just a little, draw a line right here, draw a line right here, and now right here. So you can see you're going to have a little bit of excess because this is eventually going to get cut off and not going to become your points. But these here, all of these 4-inch squares, we're now going to fold into prairie points, which are going to be on one continuous strip of fabric. So you're not having to make all of them individually. Take either your rotary cutter or a pair of scissors and cut on those drawn lines. And you want to cut all the way up to the fold line. So I do find that when doing cutting like this, it is a lot easier to use your scissors. That way you don't accidentally cut too far. Because if you cut past that fold line, essentially what you're doing is cutting into one of the other prairie points, and you don't want to do that. So you want to cut just right up to the fold. I'm just going to spin it around. Go ahead and cut on all of the lines on this side. Okay, like so, all the way down. And like I said, those little 2-inch rectangles there on the ends aren't going to get used, but we'll just leave them on there for now. They can get cut away here at the end. Whoops. Stay on your line as much as possible. And I'm going to flip this back around because I find it's easier to start when you have one of your full squares. So what you're going to do is you're going to take and you're going to fold just like we did the very first prairie point. You're trying to create your prairie point right like so, the very first fold. As if that should look very familiar. You're folding it up and in half, right up to that fold line, and then you're folding it in half again, okay? Now you're going to take and move up. So you're always going to go from, whether you started at the top and then went to the bottom, or here I went from the bottom top, you're going to work your way along. The next one we're going to take, and I'm always folding, it's like reading a book. So you're going from left to right. So I started the left end of my strip and I'm working towards the right. Same thing with my folding here. I'm going to take, and on the upper edge, I'm going to take and fold my triangle down. I'm going to go ahead and give it a press. Again, I'm just doing a finger press here because I don't have my pressing mat in place, and I'm obviously not going to press on my cutting mat, but you can be using your iron in between each step if you want. But you're going to fold this one down and over. You're now going to fold this up. Fold this back down. It's still just creating those prairie points in the same manner, but now you've automatically created them. They're overlapping, but they're connected to one another. And now every single point that we create going along here is going to be spaced evenly along the way. So now here, we are going to fold down, fold this down like so. Again, automatically overlapping, perfectly spacing your prairie points. Fold it back to complete it. Going to continue up, fold this one down here, give it a press. Fold these up like so, and then you'd have another one that you could overlap. Now, I'm obviously running out of fingers to hold these in place as I continue folding along, but you can see how these come together. And here's one that I've already done where as I have folded, I've just taken and put a pin in place, and then I would either just pin this whole thing and put it onto my quilt and then stitch, or I would, pin it first, give it a nice hard press. If I'm confident that it's going to stay together, then I don't have to worry about doing any kind of basting. But this is a quicker and easier way to do a bunch of prairie points all at the same time. Again, this allows you to perfectly space them, so you don't have to worry about, taking your prairie points that you have made like these ones here, and then measuring to overlap them and trying to make sure that you are always consistent. This just allows you to do it easier and do it all at the same time. So if you are wanting to try out prairie points on your quilts, these are 4 different ways that you can make them. Again, I did mention that you can add them instead of a binding as a fun option, but they're also something that can be fun to add if you're going to maybe create like an inner additional border onto your quilt. So again, we're going to come back to this being our fun little pretend quilt sandwich here. And maybe we want an extra fun element of the prairie points, but rather than having them stand up off the edge of the quilt, because we just don't really want that look, or we want to add an actual binding, you can make them all like so. Actually put them on your quilt just the same way. So you're lining them with your raw edges together, sew them on there, but then when you actually line up your fabric to quilt it, so we're going to pretend we've quilted it. This is now our binding that's going to go on our quilt, and we're going to wrap it around the edge and bind it. Now you have this fun quilt that you have quilted and bound, but it has these really cute little prairie points in it that lay flat on the quilt but aren't attached to the quilt, so it's just another fun way to add some extra sort of dimension and texture to your quilts. So that is 4 different ways that you can make prairie points, either side open, overlapping, or interlocking prairie points. You can make them that are open in the front. You can make them that are lined. Let me find that little guy. Lined prairie points. So those are 2-tone prairie points. And then of course you can use this fun method of making continuous prairie points, so you can make a whole bunch of them all at the same time and attach them to your next quilter project. So I really hope you give prairie points a try. They're a really fun addition to your next quilting project.